It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. The kind of cold that doesn't come from winter, but from silence. The kind that lives in morgues. The year was 2012, a quiet county in Ohio. Dr. Mark Ellison, the county coroner, had been doing this job for over 20 years. He'd seen everything. Shootings, drownings, fires, suicides, and believed there wasn't a single mystery left in death. Until that night. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes outside the small brick coroner's office. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed faintly against the hum of the refrigeration units. The night shift was nearly empty. Just Ellison, his assistant, and the sound of rubber soles on cold linoleum floors. The last case of the night had just arrived. A 34-year-old woman, identified as Sarah Whitman, a nurse, pronounced dead at the scene of a car accident on Route 35. The gurney wheels squeaked as the body was rolled in. Ellison signed the papers mechanically, his pen scratching through the silence. He pulled the sheet back, revealing her face, pale, peaceful, as if simply sleeping. Another tragedy, he muttered almost to himself. His voice, calm but weary, carried the weight of 1,000 endings. Hours later, as the building settled into stillness, something felt off. At first, it was subtle. The temperature sensors, digital readouts mounted above the stainless steel doors, began to flicker, 41 degrees, then 43. Then 46, Ellison frowned. The refrigeration unit had been serviced just last week. He tapped the monitor, no response. Probably a fault in the line, he thought. But then he noticed something stranger, her skin. When he brushed his hand against her arm to adjust the tag, he paused. It wasn't as cold as it should have been. Not frozen, not rigid. Just faintly warm, like the last trace of heat leaving a body far later than it should. He hesitated, then checked again. That's odd, he whispered. He checked the internal logs. Her time of death, 9:47 p.m. It was past 3 a.m. now, more than 5 hours. The human body doesn't hold warmth that long in these conditions. Yet her temperature hadn't dropped as expected. He ran a hand down her wrist, feeling for the faint elasticity of the skin. Nothing. No pulse, no sound. Still dead, and yet he stepped back and stared. The ECG monitor, left connected during the preliminary exam, blinked. Not rhythmically, but once. A single irregular spike. The coroner froze. The assistant looked up. Did you see that? She asked. Ellison swallowed hard. Must be static, he said. But even as he spoke, his voice faltered. The monitor flashed again, twice, then stopped. A chill passed through the room. Both of them exchanged uneasy glances. Ellison reset the machine, checked the leads, recalibrated the sensors. Nothing. Everything was working perfectly. It's just artifact, he muttered, repeating it like a mantra. But deep down, he wasn't convinced. He turned to log the anomaly when he caught something from the corner of his eye. Her fingers. The faintest twitch, barely perceptible but unmistakable. A tiny spasm in the right hand. He froze mid-step. His breath caught. Karen, he said quietly, his voice shaking. Did you see that? The assistant stepped closer. The room seemed to shrink around them. Nothing moved. The air was thick, pressing down on them. Every sound amplified. The hum of the lights. The slow drip of condensation from a nearby pipe. Ellison leaned in, his gloved hand hovering over hers. Nothing. Still. Cold. Silent. But for the first time in his career, Mark Ellison felt something he'd never felt in the morgue before. Not fear of the dead, but fear that the dead might not be dead at all. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft, endless, and silent, as somewhere, deep within the stillness of that morgue, the impossible began to stir. Sarah Whitman wasn't just a name on a morgue tag. She was a mother, a friend, a healer. 34 years old, a nurse in the ICU at Dayton General Hospital, she spent her life in the quiet, relentless service of others. Her sister, Emily, describes her as someone who carried the weight of everyone else's pain but never let it show. Old home videos show Sarah laughing with her young son, Jacob, playing catch in the backyard, a soft smile lighting her face. Her colleagues speak of her calm under pressure, the way she held patients' hands as if it made the unbearable bearable. That night, February 14th, 2012, she had worked a late shift. The winter air was thick and biting, and she drove alone along the dark stretch of Route 35 on her way home. She had been tired, yes, but careful, cautious to a fault. EMT reports later described the road as slick, the visibility low, and then the crash. A semi-truck lost control around a curve. The impact was catastrophic. Sarah's car crumpled like paper. First responders arrived within minutes. The scene was quiet, except for the mechanical whine of sirens and the snapping of emergency lights. EMTs moved quickly, assessing the damage, calling out her vitals. No pulse, no breathing, pupils fixed and unresponsive. She had been declared dead at 9:47 p.m., the words spoken with practiced clinical detachment that hid the weight they carried inside. Her body was placed on a stretcher, covered in a white sheet that did little to shield the lifeless form from the cold Ohio night. As the ambulance doors closed, carrying her to the county morgue, the narrative of Sarah's life was abruptly interrupted. a life defined by care and empathy reduced to numbers and times. Yet, even as her body was wheeled into the sterile halls of the morgue, the world outside seemed oblivious to the tragedy. Snow continued to fall silently on the empty streets. The muffled city lights flickered through the fogged ambulance windows. And inside, her son slept, unaware, dreaming of a mother who would not return home that night. The story of Sarah's life and death is told with warmth first, then heartbreak. Interviews with friends and colleagues highlight her kindness and unwavering dedication. There's a pause, a lingering grief, as the audience realizes that the woman who once soothed the frightened, comforted the dying, now lay cold in a place she knew all too well. The tension between life and loss sets the emotional foundation for what comes next. Sarah's story, grounded in compassion and human connection, contrasts sharply with the stark, unfeeling world of the morgue. It is this juxtaposition, the warmth of a life and the cold finality of death, that prepares the audience for the inexplicable events about to unfold. Her death is presented as real, absolute, and unquestionable. Yet, by the end of this section, a quiet unease lingers. The nurse who once comforted others in their final moments is gone. Or so it seemed. The morgue was silent once more, save for the mechanical hum of the refrigeration units and the faint drip of condensation from the ceiling pipes. Dr. Mark Ellison moved with practiced precision, preparing for the autopsy. He had performed hundreds, perhaps thousands of these procedures, and his motions were almost automatic. The careful placement of instruments, the checking of charts, the methodical note-taking. Yet, as he began the initial examination of Sarah Whitman's body, a subtle dissonance rippled through the sterile routine. At first, it was something he almost dismissed. Her pupils, fixed and unresponsive moments after death, now seemed slightly constricted rather than fully dilated. It was a minor anomaly, perhaps a remnant of trauma, or maybe just the way her eyes had settled. He recorded it in the log, a clinical observation, and moved on. Then came the blood. When he drew a sample for testing, the viscosity seemed unusual. It flowed sluggishly, yet not in the way typical postmortem coagulation would suggest. He frowned. His assistant, Dr. Karen Lopez, noted it as well, her brow furrowed in quiet concern. Maybe it's just cold settling, she suggested, though her voice carried a trace of unease. Ellison adjusted the sheet over her torso and reached for her wrist to confirm the pulse. Nothing. But the skin, the texture of her skin was unexpectedly warm. Not the lingering warmth of a recently deceased body, but a faint residual heat, almost imperceptible. His gloved hand hovered, uncertain. He pulled back and shook his head. Something wasn't right. The monitors attached to her for the postmortem recording had begun to flicker. A brief spike on the ECG here, a small anomaly on the blood oxygen reading there. Each instrument was functioning correctly, checked and rechecked. Ellison and Lopez exchanged uneasy glances. Could it be a residual nerve discharge? Ellison offered, his voice steady but taut. Or some metabolic anomaly we've never seen? Lopez's reply was quiet, uncertain. It doesn't make sense. As they continued, tension thickened. Every movement in the room seemed magnified. The reflective steel surfaces of the tables captured the fluorescent lights and dizzying patterns. The hum of the refrigeration units grew almost oppressive. The claustrophobic atmosphere pressed against their concentration, a reminder that the world they understood, the rigid laws of life and death, might not be complete. Ellison moved to the ECG monitor again. A tiny flicker, almost accidental, pulsed across the screen. He leaned closer, squinting. Nothing should be registering. Sarah had been declared dead over 6 hours ago. Every textbook, every protocol, every instinct told him that. And yet, the evidence on the monitors, combined with the warmth in her skin, contradicted everything he knew. The feeling of dread was subtle at first, creeping along the edges of his consciousness. And then it settled firmly, heavy and undeniable. The professional detachment he relied upon for decades began to falter. He realized that this was not a routine postmortem, not by any measure he had ever encountered. Karen Lopez stepped closer, whispering her concern about the anomalies, and together they began the impossible task of questioning reality. Was this a fault of the instruments, an unexplained biological residue, or something else entirely? Every test seemed to deepen the mystery, each observation pulling them further into disbelief. By the time Ellison paused to review the charts and logs, a quiet tension filled the room, a mix of scientific curiosity and an unspoken fear. He felt the steady foundation of his experience wobble. Something was happening here that science could not yet explain, a subtle, impossible vitality in a body that should have been entirely still, and in that dim, echoing morgue, surrounded by the cold precision of his instruments, Dr. Ellison understood for the first time that the night ahead might challenge everything he believed about death. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythm echoing through the sterile morgue. It was 3:12 a.m., and the night had stretched long and silent. Dr. Ellison had reached the point where anomalies were no longer curious. They were alarming. He adjusted his scalpel, preparing to begin the more invasive stage of the autopsy, when he noticed something impossible. A faint twitch in Sarah Whitman's hand. Ellison froze. The scalpel hovered midair. The movement was deliberate, purposeful, unmistakable. His heart thumped in disbelief. "Karen, did you see that?" he whispered, voice tight. Dr. Lopez, standing close by, nodded, her face pale. A moment of shared silence passed, heavy and incomprehensible. And then the ECG monitor, still connected to Sarah, spiked. A rhythmic pulse appeared, faint but unmistakable, like a ghost heartbeat. The flat line that should have defined hours of lifelessness was gone, replaced by a weak, irregular rhythm. Ellison stumbled backward, mind racing. His years of experience collided with a reality he could not reconcile. He reached for the emergency phone, voice shaking, calling the ER team with rapid, clipped urgency. "We have a patient coming back." The words sounded absurd, even as they left his mouth. Minutes felt like hours as a small team of nurses and physicians arrived, their faces etched with alarm and disbelief. Sarah's chest began to rise, faintly at first, then with more force. Her eyes fluttered, revealing a fragile spark of awareness. Oxygen lines were connected, defibrillator pads applied, but nothing seemed standard, nothing routine. The chaos of the room contrasted sharply with the eerie stillness that had preceded it. Equipment beeped, voices shouted instructions, hands moved with urgent precision. Yet amid the controlled frenzy, something extraordinary unfolded. A woman, declared dead for over 6 hours, was alive. Ellison stood back, shaking, watching her struggle to take a full breath. In that moment, he would later reflect, science failed me. I didn't know what to believe. It was the kind of disbelief that no medical training could prepare a person for, a collision of empirical reality and the impossible. Sarah gasped again, eyes focusing on the faces around her, lips moving in weak, rasping words. "Where am I?" she whispered, confusion mixing with the lingering fog of unconsciousness. A nurse guided her gently, trying to ground her while simultaneously marveling at the situation. Every movement, every shallow breath was a miracle, and yet it was terrifying in its implications. As emergency procedures continued, Ellison's mind struggled to catalog the impossible. Her warmth, her heart rhythm, her faint awareness. How could a body so definitively declared dead sustain life? How could consciousness, even in its most fragile form, return to a vessel that should have been irrevocably silent? The room seemed suspended in a fragile balance between disbelief and awe. Even as oxygen hissed and monitors beeped, there was a profound, silent question hanging in the air. Had they witnessed a medical anomaly, or something that transcended science entirely? By the time Sarah stabilized enough to respond to questions, a calm had settled over the team. But for Dr. Ellison, calm was impossible. His mind replayed the moments of twitching fingers, the fleeting spike on the ECG, and the impossibility of it all. It was a night that would haunt him forever, a night when the boundaries between life and death blurred, and the impossible became reality. And outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent, as if the world itself held its breath in wonder. News of Sarah Whitman's revival spread quickly, rippling through the hospital and beyond, capturing the attention of medical professionals across the country. Experts arrived from neurology, cardiology, and forensic pathology, each bringing with them a different lens, a different hypothesis. Yet every test, every analysis, seemed only to deepen the mystery. Sarah's vitals were erratic, fluctuating in ways that defied conventional medical understanding. Her brain scans revealed patterns inconsistent with both clinical death and typical coma states. Electroencephalograms showed bursts of electrical activity that should have been impossible for someone who had been declared dead for hours. Doctors and specialists argued quietly, some in awe, others in disbelief. Theories emerged rapidly. Ultra-hypothermic preservation had slowed metabolic processes, giving her body a rare resilience. Lazarus syndrome, a spontaneous return of circulation after failed resuscitation, might explain the cardiac activity. Perhaps some unknown metabolic anomaly or undiscovered biochemical process had allowed her body to maintain minimal function. Each theory offered pieces of a puzzle, yet none could explain what had truly occurred. Sarah herself offered a different perspective. In interviews, she described a sensation that felt like floating above her own body, observing the sterile confines of the morgue from a strange vantage point. She spoke of feeling the walls cold against her skin, hearing distant voices calling her back, and yet not moving toward them at first. Her recollections were chillingly precise, matching the coroner's own experiences that night. The placement of equipment, the pattern of his footsteps, the voices of his assistant. To the physicians and investigators, her memories defied conventional explanation, leaving a haunting question about consciousness and perception beyond death. Reconstructed dramatizations paired with interviews helped viewers witness the profound strain this case placed on medicine. Professionals who had dedicated their lives to understanding life and death were now confronted with a reality that exceeded their textbooks, challenging the very principles they had trusted. Ellison's voice carried over scenes of busy hospital corridors and late-night lab work. We logged every reading, every test, but none of it could explain why she came back. Despite the intensity of the scientific scrutiny, an emotional weight persisted. Sarah's family, her son Jacob, and her colleagues wrestled with gratitude, fear, and uncertainty. They had lost her, only to find her returned in a state both miraculous and terrifying. The narrative balanced. Empirical investigation with profound human reflection. The awe of doctors, the skepticism of researchers, and the fragile recovery of a woman caught between life and death. Throughout the investigation, subtle questions lingered. Could consciousness exist independently of physical vitality? Was there a threshold of life that science had yet to measure? For Dr. Ellison, the questions were personal as well as professional. Each test, each analysis, reminded him that medicine, for all its knowledge and precision, had boundaries, and that sometimes those boundaries were meant to be confronted by the inexplicable. By the end of this section, the audience is left in a space between science and the unknown, immersed in both the clinical examination and the haunting human experience. The story is no longer simply about a revival. It has become a meditation on the limits of understanding, the fragile divide between life and death, and the profound mysteries that linger in the spaces medicine cannot yet reach. Months passed, and Sarah Whitman's body began to heal, but the recovery of her mind and spirit proved far more complicated. She returned home to her son, Jacob, a 10-year-old boy who had spent months believing his mother was gone. Their reunion was tender, fragile, and filled with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. For Sarah, every moment was a reminder that life had been suspended in a way she could barely comprehend, and that the line between living and dying had been crossed in ways no one could fully explain. During therapy sessions and interviews, Sarah described experiences that seemed impossible. She remembered leaving her body, floating above the cold steel of the morgue, observing Dr. Ellison and Dr. Lopez as they prepared for the autopsy. She could hear their voices, see the placement of instruments, even note the small patterns of their footsteps as they moved through the room. It felt like I was everywhere at once, she told the investigators. I could see myself, I could see them, and I didn't want to come back. Her voice trembled with the weight of recalling a world that straddled the boundary between life and something beyond. Doctors struggled to categorize her experience. Was it a hallucination caused by hypoxia, the result of oxygen deprivation during cardiac arrest? Or was it something more, a form of consciousness persisting after clinical death, a glimpse into a reality that medical science could not yet measure? Sarah's memories were too precise, too detailed to dismiss entirely. They aligned uncannily with events recorded by the coroner and his assistant, challenging both logic and empirical understanding. Emotionally, Sarah's recovery was fragile. She feared sleep, worried that she might slip back into the void she had just escaped. Her son, sensitive and perceptive, asked her questions about the light she had seen, about the voices that called her back. "Mom says she saw me in a light," he whispered to his grandmother one evening, the words carrying both wonder and a subtle fear. These intimate moments revealed the human weight of survival, the joy of return tempered by the haunting memory of near death. Family and friends supported her with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and deep empathy. Friends who had once joked about the miracles of medical science now looked upon her with quiet reverence, understanding that something extraordinary had occurred. Yet for Sarah, every smile, every hug, carried the shadow of the experience, the knowledge that life is tenuous and that the moments we take for granted may be far more fragile than they seem. As she gradually resumed her routine helping, patience and caring for her son, the memory of the morgue remained vivid. Her experiences forced everyone around her, doctors, family, and friends, to confront uncomfortable questions about consciousness, the afterlife, and the mysteries of human physiology. The recovery was not just about healing her body. It was about integrating an encounter with the unexplainable into a life that now seemed both ordinary and miraculous at once. By the end of this section, viewers are left with a profound emotional resonance, a mixture of relief, awe, and lingering unease. Sarah's survival is miraculous, yet it carries a haunting reminder that life and consciousness may extend beyond what science can yet fully understand. Years later, Dr. Mark Ellison sits quietly in his study, the weight of that night still pressing on him. The room is lined with case files, faded photographs, and medical journals, all relics of a career spent observing the boundary between life and death. Rain taps softly against the window, a slow, relentless rhythm that mirrors the memories he cannot shake. He reflects on the night Sarah Whitman came back to life, an event that defied every principle he had ever learned, every rule he had relied upon. Ellison's voice is calm but tinged with the same disbelief he felt that night. "Every coroner writes death as fact," he says. "We sign the papers, we document the times, we close the cases. But Sarah, she reminded me that death may only be a door." He pauses, letting the words linger in the quiet study. The images of the morgue, cold steel tables, the hum of refrigeration units, the twitch of her hand, return with clarity, as if time had folded back on itself. The experience changed him, not in fear, but in humility. Years of professional certainty were shaken by a single, inexplicable event. Ellison admits that no matter how many textbooks he had studied or protocols he had followed, that night taught him that science has boundaries, and that some truths exist just beyond them. He reflects on the countless families he has witnessed lose loved ones, on the delicate, fragile line between life and death, and on how often the human body and spirit can surprise even the most experienced observers. He thinks of Sarah now, months and years removed from the morgue, living her life quietly, carefully, but forever changed. The coroner acknowledges the human element of his profession, the lies behind every case, the memories, the grief, the resilience. It was one thing to study death, he realizes, and another entirely to encounter life returning from its shadow. The story closes with a haunting resonance. Ellison speaks not only to the camera, but to anyone who has wondered about the limits of life. I still don't have all the answers. Maybe we never will. But that's the point. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only witnessed. Outside, the rain continues, falling softly on a world that moves forward, even as it holds the echoes of what cannot be explained. Finally, Sarah's voice enters, recorded from a recent interview. "Maybe we don't die," she says, quiet, almost a whisper. "Maybe we just change." The statement hangs in the air, a profound meditation on mortality, consciousness, and the fragile thread that separates existence from absence. The final image fades from the sterile steel of the morgue to sunlight, streaming through hospital curtains, a warm glow that feels both comforting and ephemeral. It is a reminder that life persists in ways both known and unknown, and that even in the coldest, most clinical places, something profound and unexplainable can emerge. The audience is left with a lingering question about the limits of medicine, the mysteries of consciousness, and the nature of life itself.